Hello, everyone. Very nice to see you all. And today we have Anita. I know we started this series about the ORB, but we are joined today by two other guests who will also be assisting us with the series. And we have Shira Brass from Ottawa, and we have Rob Cunningham from St. Thomas, London, Ontario. So, what we want to do today is we want to continue in the series and move ahead. And we're going to be covering now the phase where you've received your report for the hearing and some materials. So, what are the things, and I'm asking all of you to jump in here, what are some of the things that a lawyer should familiarize themselves with before they get into the hearings? What are the areas that they need to go and get more information about so that they can prepare themselves for that initial hearing? I don't know who wants to start, uh, but it's up to you guys. Maybe Shira, go ahead for Ottawa.
Right. So, in terms of the hearing, it's important to understand first, what does the risk assessment say in the report? What are the recommendations of the doctor? And what are the respective conditions that the doctor is recommending in light of the risk assessment? And are they recommending a disposition that involves remaining in the hospital? Are and either under a detention order or living in the community under a detention order or a conditional discharge or a best case scenario from a defense perspective, an absolute discharge. And it's important to understand what that means if especially in the case of a detention order, what that means to be under a detention order is the individual going to remain in Ottawa in the forensic assessment unit at the Royal Ottawa Hospital? Is the individual going to be in the forensic rehabilitation unit? Are they living in the community? What is the disposition and what are the actual implications on the individual's liberty? That's an important starting point to see what that means and if the conditions are, in fact, consistent with the needs of the circumstances of the case.
All right, thank you. Rob?
So by the time I've got the report, generally speaking, a couple of things have occurred. I've been retained under legal aid. I've inquired into that. Um, I will probably have spoken to the client, at least on the phone, to make sure that they want me to act for them and to get a general sense of what's going on. Um, Probably haven't met with them because it's nice to, from my perspective at least, to have a sense of what the report says, to have reviewed it, and so by the time that I meet with the client personally, I've got the report. And my sense of things is that the reports are not provided an overly long time before the hearing, and so I think it's supposed to be 2 weeks, but unfortunately, sometimes it's even less than that. But I guess what I'm trying to figure out with respect to an initial hearing with respect to a client is what's being alleged and kind of what the process is for that particular client. In my experience, generally speaking, when you have an NCR client, the first step is not any prospect, at least from the hospital's perspective, of a conditional discharge or an absolute discharge. It's usually a detention order of some sort, and you're trying to figure out from what the hospital is looking at in terms of trying to get the issue of significant threat dealt with so that um, the person can ultimately move into the community, and what the significant threats are from the hospital's perspective. And so I'm looking at kind of what the report says about what the hospital's plan is and trying to figure out if that makes sense. And I'm kind of also when I get the report, or by the time I get the report, have trying to develop a sense of it's kind of a twin goal to work with the client to ensure that the client has a sense of what's expected of him or her, so that they can make good decisions going forward, and then get a sense of the reasonability of the hospital's position and whether there are things that are overstated or with respect to the risk my client presents and how to deal with that. Um, uh, and so I'm trying to get a sense from the client most of the time in hearings I do. I'm not so much focused on trying to get the client's evidence and prepare them for a hearing to give evidence because generally speaking, they don't give. I don't call them as witnesses. We could discuss that, but so that's in a kind of a general overall sense what I'm trying to accomplish by the time I've got the report and formulating a path forward.
Thank you, Rob. Anita, what do you have to say about this phase?
So before we even get into the hearing room, I think it's great having Rob and Shira here to um, just think about the different facilities and locally, regionally, how hospitals approach this initial detention. I agree with Rob. It's most likely going to be a detention order that starts your client's journey under the ORB. That's not in every case. And when you and I met last time, Maya, we talked about those who get their absolute discharges in the
Yeah.
courtroom upon the NCR verdict. Some of those people get filtered out, so Rob and I
Mm-hmm.
may never see them. But once they're in the system, depending on certainly the serious nature or non-serious nature of the thing, where they get detained or if they get detained will depend to a degree on that. But in terms of, people practicing in this area across Ontario, if your client is starting off, let's say they came in with a homicide index offense, if they're starting off at Waypoint in Penetang in a high secure, maximum secure environment, that's just going to be a detention in that facility, and there's not going to be a lot of privileges prescribed in what they're looking at in the coming year because it's perimeter security. So they're just detained in maximum security. But you still have to have some idea of the different wards within the hospital, for example. So if you get a report, you find out your client is on this unit in that maximum secure facility, you need to know what that means for the client. So you do benefit from some familiarity with the local detaining institution. For example, at Waypoint, there's a big difference between the privileges you can get off the unit within that place. So if you're on the least privileged unit, you're effectively logged onto the unit. You can't even come off the unit. If you're on another unit, the most privileged unit, you can roam freely this huge institution effectively all day till it's curfew nighttime. So you want to know a little bit what it means. When you get a report, it tells you where your client is within an institution. You want to know if that's linked to what kind of passes and privileges by the hospital's own policy they might be able to get going forward. But regionally, I'm in Toronto, but I practice at a number of different hospitals and they all do things differently. So um, when I head into a hearing, I'm going to want to know where my client is detained, and it may be that they're not even in the hospital yet. I think that's for another brief episode to discuss what happens when your client's stuck in the jail and hasn't been transferred in despite an order for them to be in the hospital. But assuming they're in the hospital, um, my practice, whether it's in Toronto at CAMH or St. Joseph's in Hamilton or Ontario Shores in Whitby or Waypoint, they all have different ways of framing where they are going to detain a client, whether it's on a particular security level or within the institution or within the forensic program. So you want to understand what the report is telling you about the proposal. You want to understand the medical language. You want to understand the diagnosis your client has been given, which is usually on the front page of a report. You want to understand what kinds of medications they're receiving or what's being proposed for them, because that could be linked to the kind of privileges they might get. And you want to understand a little bit about the privilege level system within your institution. So one of the reasons why these little episodes are so useful for someone who wants to do this work is you cannot put this information into a book. Like you can't go through different facilities and explain how they do things, but we can flag for you that you want to know how that institution operates, and you want to understand what's meant by privileges. So maybe Rob and Shira can speak to this, but when we get a hospital report, we'll say, we're recommending a hospital-based detention with privileges up to accompanied passes in the community for 6 hours. And what does that mean? What does that maximum level of privilege mean? How does that look? And I think I'd like to hear from Shira and Rob about when they look at a report, what's being recommended? What does that mean? What do you talk to your client about? What do you have to understand? And what can you advocate for around that?
And also because doesn't have to be in this episode eventually, like if, for example, they recommend a hospital, let's say in an area where there are options, is there any way that the client can be transferred to another one as opposed to?
Yeah. So let's do, I'm going to suggest we stop this one pretty soon, see if anyone has anything else to say, and start another short video. That video will be called, institutional transfers or
Mhm.
transfers between institutions. There's a whole process around that, and there's a fair bit you want to know about that. But I think that's for another time. So yes, you can ask to be detained in the institution of your choice, but whether you get there is
Mhm.
depends on a number of factors. That's a whole other video.
All right, so we'll save that to for another one. But for to continue and just to finish on this theme that we're talking about today, Shira and Rob, is there anything that you would like to add? Um,
I think I could say one thing in terms of the hospital I deal with and have dealt with pretty much exclusively, except a little bit with Waypoint, St. Thomas. It's basically an assessment unit, a treatment unit, and a rehabilitation unit when they're preparing the NCR accused to just be discharged from the facility or go out in the community at least. So that's kind of the levels, at least in St. Thomas, that you're dealing with, and then privileges, as Anita alluded to, are many and varied. But usually there's a 5-point privilege system, which I don't have at the top of my head, but essentially that the patient is working to being able to go in the community unsupervised. And then that's where that's working. And it can be that they can't go off the ward unsupervised to start off. And so it's all kind of based on behavior modification, and they're rewarded for not posing a problem. And so some sense of what the alleged problem is from the perspective of the hospital and how they can deal with it would help in terms of trying to give them advice and trying to deal with what the issues are for that patient.
all right, thank you, Shira.
Yeah, so it is also similar in Ottawa in that there are different degrees of privileges can be remaining on the ward at all times, up into unsupervised passes off the hospital grounds. One place that anyone in Ottawa knows is that often patients will go to Westgate Mall, which is right near the hospital. That is a place that's frequented when patients are given off hospital passes and privileges. One thing is that's important to know is that it's very much treated like a carrot and stick approach, that it's a reward that's given, but it's something that can be taken away from them if they don't comply, if they choose not to take their medications. And it's very much of that sort of paternalistic approach when it comes to the privileges that's not always tied to risk, but rather tied to how much the person is following the rules put in place.
Sorry, this is
When
a little bit like in youth detention centers. They have that kind of system as well for those who do youth law. It's a little bit similar as well to that. So sorry, Shira.
and that's something that we do see happening in Ottawa, that the degree of privilege can be tied to just how cooperative from the hospital's perspective the patient is being. And then it'll be taken away if anything comes up, if they choose not to comply with the medications that are recommended, or some sort of dispute happens within the hospital, whether it's the patient that initiated it or not. These are things that can arise where they do get those privileges taken away. So that's something to note.
All right, thank you. So I guess this is it for today, for this episode. So we will be continuing on in the process in another one. Thank you, everyone.